Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Kunsthistorisches Museum here in Vienna. My name is Stefan Krause. I'm the director of the Imperial Armory here at the Kunsthistorisches Museum and the curator of the exhibition Iron Man Fashion in Steel, which is open for everybody at the moment here at the museum. And today, this evening, I have the great pleasure to welcome Tobias Capwell, the curator of Arms and Armour at the Wallace Collection in London. He will speak about armor in the life of a Renaissance nobleman from cradle to grave. And yeah, I am very happy that you are here and we'll be talking about this subject. Toby, please.
Thank you so much, Stefan. Thank you also to the Kunsthistorisches Museum for inviting me to speak to you tonight. I just want to say also that the Wallace Collection is very proud to be part of this exhibition with the first loans of armor ever to be granted in 120 years of our history. So this is a very big moment for us as well as for the museum here in Vienna. I'm also very pleased to have written a little something for the catalog on a subject which I'm going to speak to you again tonight about. I'm going to try and expand the subject matter of my chapter in the catalog a bit more, deal with more visual material and more examples, and we'll see where we get. So, for most people, the image of the knight in full-plate armor conjures up thoughts of the Middle Ages, or of a mythic medieval realm, of legendary heroes, dragons of the other world. The knight archetype, in his glittering steel carapace, is not just a figment of the modern imagination, however. He is a fundamental icon in historical European art. So he looms rather large in the contemporary conception of the Middle Ages for good reason. However, the archetypal armor, the complete polished harness of articulated steel plates, did not appear until the 14th century, and was really an innovation of the Renaissance. The golden age of armor, as both functional technology and expressive art, occurred in the later 15th and 16th centuries. The rapid development of gunpowder weapons and the expanded employment of professional armies posed significant threats to fully armored cavalry, but even so, knightly combat traditions flourished during the Renaissance, as did the ideals of chivalry. And in the 16th century, mounted knights continued to play essential roles on the battlefield. At the same time, jousts, tournaments, and chivalric spectacles became more of a part of noble life, really, than ever before. And meanwhile, the iconography of knighthood was a core element of really all visual art. For the nobility, the people who paid for the Renaissance, armor was not just a tool to be brought out in time of war. It was an ever-present feature of life, from birth to death, and indeed beyond. When a boy, especially the first son, was born to a noble family, his arrival was often celebrated in accordance with the chivalric tradition, with formal combat. The future of a dynasty depended on healthy children who, as adults, would be capable physically and mentally of taking on military, political, social, and economic responsibilities. The birth of a male child demonstrated the future viability of the family line. Therefore, that child's potential as a warrior and a leader was actively anticipated and presented to the world even before the child could walk or talk. On the 1st of January, 1511, Queen Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England, bore a son by her husband, King Henry VIII of England. The king immediately called for a passage of arms to be held at Westminster, on which he spent the truly astronomical sum of nearly £4,000, actually £4,400, more than the total cost of his state-of-the-art warship, the Mary Rose, which had been built less than 2 years earlier. This luxurious event, which took place in February of 1511, was comprised of a series of jousts at the tilt, that's the barrier, a so-called royal joust between the king's team of defenders, which were normally referred to, the defenders in a tournament were called tenants or tenants, the sort of defenders of the field. And then they faced a much larger group of challengers called the venans or the comers or the answerers. This event was a series of formal combats, but foremost, it was on a kind of deeper level. It was an expression of Henry's love for his queen and the gratitude for his heir, who was also named Henry. But sadly, the baby died. In May 1527, Henry's ally, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, who's also, of course, King Charles I of Spain, held tournaments in Valladolid to mark the arrival of his firstborn son, Prince Philip of Spain, later King Philip II. These combat spectacles were inspired by the chivalric romance, Amadis of Gaul, a book that later became the prince's favorite. The imperial ambassador was so impressed by the proceedings that he expressed the opinion that the king's deeds of arms were more daring and accomplished than any in the book. So, the martial training of a young Renaissance nobleman started as soon as it was a physical possibility. Education in the art of horsemanship began as early as the age of 4. When my children were 4, I had a hard time with this. But Henry VIII himself was apparently already an accomplished horseman. Apparently, at the age of 3 years and 4 months old, he rode a war horse alone through the streets of London to Westminster to be made Prince of Wales and the royal heir on 29th of October, 1493, a feat that greatly impressed people at the time, as you can imagine. As he was taking his first steps towards attainment of knighthood, the noble child's imagination was infused with dreams of the adventures to come. Through exposure to the chivalric romances, in his instruction in music, dance, and song, and even the toys that he played with. The collection of the Imperial Armory here in Vienna contains 2 jousting toys dating from the early 16th century. They're little metal knights on horseback, and the horses are set on wheels so that you can crash them together. And Charles V's grandfather, the Emperor Maximilian, is shown playing with such toys as a child in an illustration of the semi-autobiographical Der Weißkönig, published between 1514 and 16. Maximilians don't have wheels, but I'm sure the children managed to crash them together just fine. Once the child was able to sit a horse, the process of learning to fight in armor from the saddle began. A considerable number of Renaissance armors made for children are today preserved in the world's museums. Many are purely ceremonial, but some are practical fighting armors, such as the field harness made for Maximilian's son, Philip the Handsome, Archduke of Burgundy and future King of Castile. Now this armor, the little one, I've given the other armor there just as a size comparison, is made around the same time in the same place, so you get a sense of the size of the child's armor. This was a gift from Philip's great uncle, Archduke Sigismund of Tyrol. And it's a wonderful little encapsulation of the very latest armor technology of that time and place. It was made in Innsbruck by Hans Prunner between 1488 and 89. And we know that because the 10-year-old Archduke wrote personally to his uncle to thank him for the generous gift. Such armors were sometimes worn in tournaments and in parades and other ceremonial roles, although I think the most routine practical use of armor for children was undoubtedly in training. Certainly by the age of 12 and probably earlier, the future King Henry VIII of England was training with a personal master of arms. And such physical education, which would have involved learning the use of various types of sword, spear, axe, and dagger, as well as unarmed combat, of course, would have required the prince to have good plate armor in which to conduct his exercises. You know, the human body needs to evolve and change to work well inside an armor. Your body is the engine that powers the equipment. So, as well as learning the martial techniques, it was very important for the child's body to become slowly accustomed to working in the armor. Moving on a little bit, interestingly, this is one of the earliest portraits of the future Emperor Charles V at the age of about 15. I think this is a fascinating portrait too because it shows that already, even at a young age, the future emperor already has distinct personal taste expressed in his armor in the form of pinstripes. This is the thing about Charles V as an individual. He loved pinstripes. He's a real trendsetter, I suppose, in that regard. And if you look, it's amazing that in the portrait he already has them, because in Madrid and in other collections with his equipment surviving, there are many. The vast majority have pinstripes. It's just a taste thing. And another important aspect of a young nobleman's education was hunting. The chase required skill with a variety of weapons as well as nerves of steel, especially when hunting dangerous game such as wild boar. The physical and psychological demands of hunting made it, in the eyes of many contemporary experts, the best training for war. As famously argued by Gaston III, the 11th Count of Foix, better known as Gaston Phoebus, in his highly influential book on Book of the Hunt, written around 1387, 89, around then, Gaston says, "Hunting is a training for all types of fighting met with in war. For every kind of martial encounter, hunting is a better training than jousting. If the tourney teaches a man how to strike with a sword on a helmet, how much better will he learn by striking down a boar with his only chance of saving himself is by a good thrust with his spear." So, you can imagine, in such situations, armor was sometimes worn, another of its varied uses throughout the nobleman's life. In a series of tapestries designed by Bernard van Orly, depicting the months of the year and made about 1533, the Emperor Maximilian here is posthumously portrayed as a young man hunting boar with a sword from horseback, perhaps the most dangerous of all hunting forms. And here the paragon of Renaissance chivalry is represented as having taken an important precaution in his accoutrements. He's wearing full leg armor, while his prize boarhound is protected by an armor of thickly padded textile. It's hard to see here, but I think he's also wearing an armored saddle, which gives you a sense of how dangerous a boar is and what it might do to you. Since the Middle Ages, knighthood was usually conferred at the age of about 16, ideally before a major battle. Famously, Edward, Prince of Wales, the so-called Black Prince, son and heir of King Edward III of England, was knighted at 16 before the Battle of Crécy in 1346. The prince then led the English vanguard against the French, experiencing intense fighting at considerable personal risk. And slightly later, another great knight of the 100 Years' War, Jean Le Mangre, so-called Boucicaut, was knighted at the same age, 16, by Louis II, Duke of Bourbon, on the eve of the Battle of Rüsbeck in 1382. From his teens into his early 20s, the Renaissance knight entered his physical prime as a practitioner of the martial arts. He had around 15 years of training and experience behind him at this point, and his body had had around 10 years to grow accustomed to bearing armor. Having reached his majority, the young nobleman also had to take a more active, visible role in courtly life, in whichever circle his birth and affinity placed him. Beyond military service, participation in tournaments was perhaps the most important endeavor at this stage of his life. As well as continuing to be essential combat training, as they had been since the Middle Ages, tournaments in the 16th century were also political and social events of great significance. Active participation in such formal combats guaranteed access to the highest circles of European society, bringing a young nobleman to the attention of kings and princes and allowing him to build his network of influential contacts and friendships. And crucially, the possession of good armor and the ability to use it made this whole process possible. Without it, many key advantages were simply out of reach. Equestrian contests in the 16th century had two principal forms. The joust was a one-on-one contest run with the heavy cavalry lance in a series of charges or courses, and the object essentially was to strike the opponent as accurately and forcibly as possible. The tourney was a close mounted combat, usually fought by this time with swords, either in teams or between individuals. It's important to note, too, that during the Renaissance, both of these types of knightly contest occurred in many different forms. There's a lot of variations of joust and tourney, and they all employ different rules and armor types. Formal combats on foot were also becoming more fashionable by 1520. Such contests were fought either in an arena enclosed with a stockade, the so-called champ clos, or over a waist-high fence, a type of combat referred to as the barriers, or combat at the barriers. This is a particularly fun one here, where you see a combat at the barriers occurring indoors, which is interesting. And also you have one team on one side of the barrier dressed up like wild men in hairy costumes, sort of Sasquatches with helmets. And then on the other side, the other team, who are men, are dressed up as Amazons. And this is the kind of fabulous fantasy dress-up that such contests could involve by this period. You can see other teams are waiting in the wings, and they're dressed like, monsters and whatever. And all of these encounters, joust, tourney, foot combat, they're all opportunities to advance one's honor and fame under the gaze of the aristocratic elite. And all of it required specific equipment and training. Perhaps the greatest chivalric spectacle of the age was the courtly festival held at the Habsburg Palace at Basch, near Mons in the Netherlands, in August of 1549. The spectacle was attended by Charles V, the Spanish royal court, and most of the leading members of the Flemish and Burgundian aristocracy. The spectacle was hosted, though, and conceived by Mary of Hungary, the emperor's sister and Habsburg governor of the Netherlands. Devised by Mary as one of the highlights of the royal progress across Europe made by the emperor's son, Prince Philip, the so-called Felicissimo Viaje, or Joyous Journey, which took place between 1548 and 51. The Basch spectacle involved armored fighting of 7 different kinds. And it's worth going through this in a little bit of detail, just to kind of put yourself in the position of these people. On the first day of the spectacle, there was combat both in the Champ Clos and at the barriers. And the fighting in the Champ Clos was fought in full tonlet armors like this. The tonlets are these wide skirts that give you a lot of extra protection around your hips and your upper legs. You wouldn't wear that on the battlefield, but in a formal combat, you can afford to wear a lot more specialized protection. And interestingly, just as a side note, the middle armor is a tonlet armor of the emperor himself, Charles V, now in Madrid. And it seems in this period, there was a kind of literary artistic association that built up between the fence of the stockade, of the Champ Clos, that the combat is fought in, and the much bigger stockades that were used to enclose hunting grounds. And you get this interesting association between hunting and fighting in these foot combats. And Charles V's armor is decorated with hunting scenes. And at Basch, one of the teams appeared as huntsmen in their armor, dressed with whatever huntsmen wear. And they released rabbits and cats into the arena, and then had hounds chase them and kill them in the arena before they went and fought themselves. It's, again, a lot of theatricality involved. The collective noun for cats, incidentally, in English is clouders. Not a word I've ever used, but I got to use it in my publication on Basch, and I was very proud of that, just as a side note. So, then there's the foot combats. Then after the Champ Clos combats in the tonlet armors, they took a break, and they needed about maybe half an hour to set up the barrier for the next round of combats. And that gave all of these participants time to convert their armor from the tonlet configuration to the barriers configuration. And basically what they needed to do was take off the bottom half, because the barrier combat is fought in half armor with nothing on the legs, because you have a protective fence. And these armors are actually designed so you can take the tonlet off and you can take the leg armor off without touching the top half. And if you see what they're doing at Basch, where they only have 20 minutes, half an hour, they can't take the whole armor off and put some other armor on. So these garnitures, go and see the exhibition. You can see that that the one on the left and the one on the right are both in there. They have little turn pins, and you can just strip them without touching the upper half. It's things like that that make me happy. When the documents agree with the objects, it doesn't happen very often. So after all of that foot combat, the next part of the spectacle was a massive passage of arms, where the comers, the challengers, had to fight 3 champions in sequence, one after the other. And the first champion they had to fight was several courses in the joust of war, a joust run in field armor in the open field with no tilt and no extra protective equipment. Then the next champion they had to fight on horseback with the sword, and then the third champion required them to get off their horse, take their leg armor off, incidentally again, didn't have a picture for that, and then fight with the sword. And if they get through all of those challenges, they're allowed to get on a boat, cross a river, climb up a theatrical stage mountain, and try to pull a sword out of a pillar. But nobody was allowed to successfully pull the sword until Prince Philip himself got there and did it, you know. You get special privileges if you're the prince. Also, as well as all of that, Bash involved a mock siege on a special day. So all the knights who had been fighting in all this, their heavy jousting and foot combat armors, they took all that off, and for the mock siege, they all participated in kind of formal light cavalry skirmishes, shooting off, firearms with no, ball in them, the Renaissance equivalent of blank charges, and doing all of this complex light cavalry maneuvering as part of this siege. And this is fascinating to me because it shows that even parts of these armors that we identify as strictly for the field, like the light cavalry armor that Charles V is wearing in his famous portrait by Titian in Madrid, even those parts were important also for courtly spectacles and tournaments. And finally, on the last day of Bash was the hazardous free tourney, a formal cavalry battle fought in teams, which opened with a mass lance charge, and the teams are like 35 or 40 knights aside, and then the combat continues with swords until someone says stop, basically, someone with authority. And the free tourney was held on the last day because it's the most dangerous, and all of the major injuries that occurred at Bash happened in the free tourney. So the way they planned these events was, very, very well informed as well. And when you're studying arms and armor and this kind of thing, it's very important to remember that, this is a story of real people's lives. And when you see armor in a museum, it's this empty thing in a glass box. But we have to always try and get the people back into this. So just briefly, the combatants at Bash included some of the most important noblemen of the age, many of whom were then in their late teens or early 20s. These included, from left to right here, Emmanuel Ironhead Philibert, Prince of Piedmont, later Duke of Savoy. I only found out today that armor he's wearing in that portrait is next door in the Hofburg. How did I get this far without knowing that? In the middle there is Jean de Gleims, the Marquis de Burgess, who, according to eyewitnesses, fought brilliantly with the sword. And then we also have Lamoral, the Count of Egmont, who was described as vigorous as a bull, wielding his sword like a rustic cudgel. Then we have Jean de Ligne, the Duke of Ehrenberg, Floris de Montmorency, Lord of Hubermont, and Charles de Brimeau, Count of Meghan. I didn't have a portrait for him, so that's just meant to be him. It's good to have a reference of some kind. The Count of Meghen, who struck fear into the hearts of all who witnessed the combat. And of course, the star of the show was the 22-year-old Prince Philip himself, in whose honor the spectacle was held and who played a pivotal role in all of the combats. Another young knight of more modest means who distinguished himself at Binche was Luis Zapata de Chaves, a flamboyant and loquacious lord from Spain who had served as a page to Prince Philip and later as a knight accompanied him on his travels between 1548 and 51. And he fought in many of the tournaments and formal combats along the way, including jousts at Brussels and Antwerp and at Binche. Zapata at Binche was only one of 10 out of 33 to complete the arduous pas d'armes on the theme of the adventure of the enchanted sword, which I mentioned earlier. His mounted sword fight was judged to be the best of the day. And in his early 20s, Zapata was already a formidable knight. He was also, interestingly, an aspiring author, and later went on to write a hugely important treatise on jousting, Del Justador, which he wrote between 1589 and 93. And he makes sure in that work to let you know just how good he actually was. He also mentions that Prince Philip wasn't actually very good at jousting. He says he never broke many lances. The diversity of combat forms practiced by knights during the 16th century, both in tournament spectacles and on the battlefield, motivated the development of what we now call the garniture, an armor system involving one or more complete harnesses furnished with sets of exchange pieces, extra parts that allowed the armor to be configured for different types of fighting. Some garniture configurations, for jousting especially, offered more protection at the cost of mobility, while others provided excellent mobility and comfort whilst being somewhat less protective. With all of its pieces unified by a distinctive decorative scheme, usually involving etching and gilding, the garniture was not only just essential martial equipment, it was also a powerful visual statement of status, taste, and magnificence. In his 20s, when the young nobleman sought to distinguish himself in the eyes of his peers and superiors, the garniture was a vital tool, not just in practical terms, but also to the process of building a strong reputation. One of the greatest Renaissance garnitures to survive is the eagle garniture of Ferdinand II, Archduke of Austria, a nephew of Charles V, made in 1547 for the 18-year-old Archduke. This fabulous masterpiece of the armorer's art provides the essential armor formations for serving light, medium, and heavy cavalry roles on the battlefield, as well as those for jousts of war and of peace, foot combat, free tourney, barriers, everything. It's so big that it's a very hard thing to photograph. This is a fabulous photograph by the museum, but it's still missing some pieces. This is not a fabulous photograph, but it was the only one I could take at the time that includes this incredible horse armor and all of the many of the other extra pieces, some of which are, of course, now in the exhibition. The eagle garniture also shows how effectively imagery and iconography were employed in this remarkable form of body art, with the eagle of Austria featuring as the main decorative motif, and it gives the armor its unique character. This armor is very elaborate and costly, as you can see, while the garnitures owned by most knights tended to be somewhat more modest. Nevertheless, such equipment was absolutely essential to their lives, since without it, they could not appear alongside their lords and masters in formal combats and courtly spectacles, nor indeed could they defend their lands and people in time of war. This is just another little aside I wanted to put in. When I was looking for my portraits for my talk, I found this one of the Marquis de Berquès, and I was amazed to find him wearing an armor decorated with these progressing gold and steel chevrons that move around all of the borders. They almost seem animated somehow. And there is one of these surviving. It's not the Marquis's armor, but it's another one decorated in the same manner. And this is a really useful one to bring up under, now, because it's one of these more modest garnitures. Of course it's fantastic to provide 85 different pieces for every kind of combat you can imagine. But I think also there's a certain deeper technical cleverness in the challenge to the armorer to serve all of those functions with fewer pieces. How can you make the armor work for everything on a budget, essentially? And this Augsburg garniture does this. The field armor, the core of the armor, is now in the Royal Armouries in Leeds in the UK, but all of the exchange pieces are in the Wallace collection under my care. And there's really never many more pieces than what you see here. There's a vamplate that ended up in Turin, and there's another vamplate that ended up in Écouen near Paris. But basically what you're seeing, the vamplates are the guards on the lances. But basically what you see here is what you get. And cleverly using the single base of the armor, it still does everything. It does at least 3 types of joust. It does light, medium cavalry service in the field as well as heavy cavalry. It's got an alternate helmet. It's a really ingenious thing. And this shows you that these quite rich armors, there were mid-range levels where the decoration is very fine, but not unique to that particular armor. So, you could be forgiven for thinking when you look, at a fabulous exhibition like this or a fabulous Renaissance collection, this must be all about rich people. This is all about rich people. But what did, people of a more modest status and means do? But there are examples like this of some plainer garnitures, simpler things that are really much less expensive. In this case, still quite nice, though. A knight's active career could last for quite a long time in the 16th century, into his 50s and sometimes even longer. Another of the more successful combatants at the tournament at Binche was Juan Quijada De Rio, a Spanish man-at-arms, as he called himself, who, as a young man, served in the elite bodyguard of King Ferdinand II of Aragon and Queen Isabella I of Castile. Quijada was around 65 years old when he fought with great distinction at the Binche spectacle, and he was the first Venin to complete the passage of arms, for which feat he was awarded a gold circlet in honor of his prowess. And as a further indication of his exceptional knightly credentials, Quijada had, the year before Binche, authored one of the most important Renaissance treatises on armored combat on horseback, the Doctrina dell'arte della Cavaliera, written in 1548. And there's the frontispiece of the printed edition. The career of one of Quijada's contemporaries, who also spent his life in the service of the Habsburgs, was perhaps even longer. Conrad von Boinberg was a faithful and capable commander who fought for the German emperors for many years. This is a posthumous portrait in the Imperial Armoury, and it shows, painted in 1582, and it records his impressive military career as a pile of inscribed commanders' batons scattered at his feet. And these include the imperial commands at the sack of Rome in 1527, the siege of Metz in 1552, and the Battle of San Quentin in 1557, Philip of Spain's greatest victory. And the portrait's inscription states that it shows the sitter in 1565 at the age of 71, still clad in his armor and prepared for battle. Such was Boinberg's fame in his lifetime that this armor was deemed worthy of preservation by the Archduke Ferdinand in his Hall of Heroes, the Heldenkammer, at Ambras Castle in Innsbruck, together with the portrait. Boinberg died peacefully at the age of 73. No small achievement, considering his violent life in harness. Quijada and Boinberg were clearly blessed with good physical health, and undoubtedly also a fair amount of good luck. Many of their contemporaries were not so fortunate. Of, for example, Quijada's fellow Bash veterans, whose fates are known, the Duke of Arenberg was slain in battle in 1568. The Duke of Savoy and the Count of Megen died of illnesses. The Marquis of Bergès was killed in a ball game accident. And Lamoral of Egmont and Floris de Montmorency were executed by Philip II. As it had done throughout his life, armor accompanied the Renaissance knight in death. In high-status funerals, such as that of King Henry VII of England, a mourner wearing the deceased knight's armor rode on one of the dead man's horses in the funeral procession up to the high altar, where he dismounted and was disarmed, signifying the surrender of earthly powers back to God. By the late Middle Ages, pieces of armor were also being set up as funerary achievements over a dead knight's tomb as signs of his identity and relics of his noble life in arms. The popularity of this practice in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries has meant that many pieces of armor, especially helmets, have been preserved when they would probably never have survived otherwise. The tradition of displaying a helmet as part of a funerary monument in a church, usually mounted high above on a wall or near the tomb, was especially popular in England, where hundreds of instances are recorded. And although the practice originally made use of the deceased knight's own helmet and pieces of armor, by the 16th century it was often difficult to be sure if a lifetime connection between the memorial armor and the memorialized individual actually exists. Often older helmets were acquired specifically for funerary use, and in England it's fairly common to find 15th century helmets associated with 16th century monuments, or 16th century helmets associated and hung over 17th century monuments. Nevertheless, there are some notable 16th century cases where the funerary helm does seem to still be the dead knight's own. An excellent example may be found at the Church of All Saints at God's Hill on the Isle of Wight, the final resting place of Sir John Lee, who died in 1529. He was a friend and supporter of King Henry VII and also governor of the Isle of Wight from 1486. And above Sir John's monument hangs his funerary helm. This is an especially important survival since it's the foremost remaining exemplar of a very rare form of late 15th century Flemish close helmet. It's a typology whose period of use is strictly limited to circa 1480 to 1500. And it's now only represented by a small number of examples, all preserved in English churches. Thus, the form and construction of Sir John's funerary helm agrees well with the dates of his active service as a knight and military commander. Now, before the Reformation, Christians in Europe believed that the progress of a dead person's soul through purgatory to heaven and the ultimate afterlife could be assisted by the living through the process of intercession. Intercessionary prayers offered by friends, relatives, or clergymen could reduce the amount of time a soul was forced to suffer in the cleansing fires on the way to salvation. In the 16th century, the Reformation drew many people away from this belief, which was firmly rejected by Jan Hus, Martin Luther, and the other leaders of the Protestant movement. At the same time, though, Catholics vehemently maintained it. One of the most important ways knights immortalized themselves in art was primarily motivated by the belief in purgatory and the process of intercession. These funerary monuments, set up in churches by the represented individual before death in many cases, or by his executors afterwards, are not merely glorified tombstones. They are pleas for intercessionary prayers. Moreover, the lifelike sculptural representation of the deceased was believed to assist the effectiveness of such prayers, and in the case of knightly monuments, the sculptor's ability to accurately render plate armor in carved marble or alabaster was an extremely important aspect of this art form. The image of a dead knight armed for battle, lying on the lid of his tomb chest, is often the only visual representation of this person to survive. Funerary effigies also often record the design and construction and decoration of real armors that no longer exist. And I'm going to give you one more example. This is a good one. This is a Renaissance monument at Breda, commemorating Engelbrecht II, Count of Nassau, who died in 1504, but it was built by Engelbrecht's nephew and successor, Count Henry II of Nassau-Dellenburg-Dietz, who lived until 1538. And Henry, the nephew of the deceased, was Chamberlain of the Emperor Charles V and an important military commander in the service of the Habsburgs. And this is really important and interesting because here we see the deceased on this kind of double layer tomb with the replica, marble replica armor placed on top. So here the effigy is almost referring to those funerary offerings of armor. But you can't put a real armor on a tomb like that forever because it'll rot away. It'll rust and it'll disappear and get stolen. But a marble one is eternal. And this monument records a lost armor by Charles V's court armorer, Colman Helmschmied. This armor doesn't survive, but the Chamberlain of the Emperor clearly had one, and it's there in marble. These carved the inside of the armor, the internal leathers, the fastenings, the fittings. If you compare it to an armor of this period that survives in the Wallace collection, they're not exact matches, but they're obviously precisely the same kind of typology, made at exactly the same moment by the same person. Look at this, even this. If I've got a pointer here, let's see. Yeah, see this? Look at this. This is the inside of the shoulder plate, the right shoulder plate. And you see this little curving thing here? This is an internal spring, okay? And it's on a little forked tooth that sits on this plate here. So what this allows you to do is when you lower your lance and the butt of the lance comes up behind, a little bit of pressure is exerted on the bottom of that plate, and that spring releases and the plate just clicks up. It just goes click, and it gets out of the way of your lance. Totally unnecessary. You don't need that, but it's really, really impressive and cool. And this is initially really an innovation, a luxury of the Helmschmieds. And hey presto, on the Wallace armor that's precisely contemporary, you've got the same mechanism. It's right there. And I've done it. You poke the armor with your finger and it goes click. And you let go of the pressure and it clicks back down again. Fabulous. That's my last aside. So, in conclusion, thousands of medieval and Renaissance monuments remain in churches and museums today. And in this way, the ancient Christian belief in the afterlife has preserved an enormous visual record of the knight's appearance, accoutrements, and character. And effigies like this allow us to see the knight as he wished to be remembered for eternity, with his body enclosed by his life's constant companion, his armor. Thank you.